Our presentation today is on the proposed revisions to FLSA overtime rules, and we're going to have Rhonda Stevens from BBSI take us away. Go ahead, Rhonda.
Okay, thanks, Tyson. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today to talk about the overtime rule changes under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and I will refer to that as FLSA from here out. So this past summer, the U.S. Department of Labor, or the DOL, released proposed rules updating the FLSA overtime pay rules. These were kind of a long time coming. It's been since 2004 since there have been any changes to these rules, and because part of the one element of the rules has to do with salary levels, 12 years by the time these rules are effective is kind of a long time not to make those changes. So these have been anticipated. The final rules are still pending, but the changes will be effective sometime in 2016, and it's projected that will probably be mid-2016. So we've got a little while to plan. The proposed rules address the salary level for exemption from overtime, but there were no proposed changes to the duties test, which was a surprise. The DOL has talked quite a bit about changing the duties test, trying to make it a little more understandable, but there were no changes in the proposed rules to those duty tests, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So today we'll be covering the current FLSA overtime rules. We'll talk about the new proposed rules. We'll talk about what experts expect in the final rules and possible changes to the duties test. And we'll talk about what steps employers can take now to prepare for compliance. Okay. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, is the federal statute that regulates wages and hours in employment. It covers minimum wage, overtime pay, child labor standards, and record keeping. The proposed rules make changes only to the overtime requirements, and so we'll just focus on that today. FLSA exempts some employees from minimum wage and overtime pay if they meet certain tests. There are basically three categories of requirements, which are salary level, salary basis, and job duties tests. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit more in the next few slides. I've listed out the white-collar exemptions. They're in the bullets, and those are the most common exemptions. There are a few other ones that we won't cover today that are very industry specific, but the common ones are executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, computer employee, and highly compensated. So currently the minimum salary level, which is the level that, this is the first test, so this is the level that employees have to be paid in order to meet the any of the exemptions really, except for highly compensated. But again, this is only one of a three-part test. So the minimum salary level currently is $455 per week. That can be converted to whatever your pay period is in the amount shown, but you can't meet the requirement over a longer period, meaning that you can't average it over a period of months or a year. It has to be met either weekly or by pay period. So for context only, I've shown the annualized amount equivalent of $455 per week, which is $23,660. The pay also has to be free and clear, meaning it has to be in cash wages. It can't include non-cash compensation or items of value like fringe benefits, company car, travel allowance. So moving on to the salary basis test, this is about how the wages are paid. And it has to be a predetermined amount per pay period. It cannot change based on quality or quantity of the work performed. The full salary has to be paid for any week that the employee performs any work. So you cannot deduct or reduce their pay if they take time off, like maybe they don't have accruals, they take time off. If they take 1 day or a day and a half within a week, you can't reduce their pay for that. There's one exception to the salary basis if they're paid on a fee basis, but it has to be a fee basis as described in the regs. And that applies to anything except for the executive exemption. You can't pay on a fee basis for that exemption. Okay. So the trickiest requirement for exemption by far is the duties test, and this is the third of the three tests that we were talking about. The two most common exemptions are executive and administrative. This is where the lion's share of noncompliance is. and where the IRS estimates billions in lost tax revenue. It's also the most lucrative for plaintiff attorneys and the most costly for employers. So these are really tricky. So to just briefly go through the requirements to meet the exemptions, keep in mind that the terms we use, like independent judgment, exercise of discretion, those are really key sticking points. They're not completely definitive. You can read pages and pages and pages of discussion on what those mean between examples that are provided in guidance, agency opinions, case law, or court transcripts. So to briefly go through the executive exemption, the primary duty of the individual to meet this exemption is managing the enterprise or a customarily recognized department or subdivision, and they have to customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 full-time equivalent employees, and have the authority to hire or fire, or that particular weight is given to those recommendations. With the administrative exemption, the primary duty is office or non-manual work directly related to management or general business operations of the employer or its customers. And it must include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment on significant matters. And that is probably one of the most ambiguous and probably contested and discussed requirements that there are in any of these exemption tests, is what is exercise of discretion, what is independent judgment on significant matters, and what are significant matters themselves. Okay, so moving to the next slide, we'll talk about the professional exemption, and the professional exemption is subcategorized into learned professional and creative professional. So for the learned professional, the primary duty is work requiring advanced knowledge, predominantly intellectual, requiring consistent exercise of discretion and judgment, and advanced knowledge is in a field of science or learning, and those are fairly well defined in the regs. And advanced knowledge is customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. Then moving to the creative professional, the primary duty is work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized artistic or creative field. The next slide, computer employee. This is another category that employers often misuse according to the DOL, because it's really easy to think that anybody working in high tech probably meets this because it's it's technical, not everybody knows it, can do it, but there are a lot of IT type of jobs that don't qualify for this exemption, so be careful if you're going to use it. So the computer employee must be employed as a computer systems analyst, computer programmer, software engineer, or a similarly skilled worker in the computer field. The primary duty consists of, these are kind of technical, determining hardware, software, or system functional specifications by applying systems analysis techniques and procedures. And that can include consulting with users. Designing, developing, documenting, analyzing, creating, testing, or modifying computer systems or programs, including prototypes, based on and related to user or system design specifications, or designing, documenting, testing, creating, or modifying computer programs related to machine operating systems, or any combination of the above requiring the same skill level. So yeah, that one's kind of tough to work out. And the final white-collar exemptions are outside sales and highly compensated. So for outside sales, we're talking about somebody who's making sales, and sales are, that term is defined in the regs, or obtaining orders or contracts for paid services or paid use of facilities, and customarily and regularly working away from the employer's place of business. Then highly compensated requires total annual compensation of $100,000 or more, and customarily and regularly performs at least one of the duties of an exempt executive, administrative, or professional. So you go back to those duties, tests, and the person has to meet at least one of those. So just to kind of contrast, blue collar or manual laborers, even including those in high-paying trades like carpenters, electricians, operating engineers, longshoremen, no matter how much they're paid, they're still entitled to overtime. So they will not, anybody doing manual labor will not qualify for these exemptions. So moving on to the new proposed rules with some background. In March of 2014, President Obama issued a memo to the Secretary of Labor basically directing them to modernize and streamline the overtime rules. The goal was to expand the number of employees eligible for overtime, of course. And then in June of 2015, the DOL talked about the changes that were coming. This was not their official notice, but they came out with the changes that they were going to be making. The major change being that the salary threshold would more than double for white-collar exemptions, and that they would provide for an automatic annual update of the salary threshold. As I mentioned, it's been since 2004 that was updated, and you know, I think there are probably a lot of exempt workers that are qualifying at the previous salary level that, you know, definitely will be moved out. And in fact, we have in a later slide, we have the DOL's estimate of how many of those are. So by updating it, they're definitely going to be keeping more people either out of the exemption status, or employers are going to have to pay more to keep them exempt. So in July 2015, the DOL issued its official notice of proposed rulemaking. So that started the required 60-day comment period, which is ended in September, but they still have not given us the final rules, and that's not expected until February. And then mid-2016 is the projected timeline for the rules to be effective. So as far as the changes, the proposed rules are all about the salary level increases. The minimum threshold is probably going to be set at the 40th percentile of earnings for full-time salaried workers. So the projection on what that means in terms of dollars in 2016, the weekly threshold would go from 455 to 970. And then for context, the annualized amount goes from 23,600 to 50,004. Highly compensated threshold, which is currently 100,000, will go to the 90th percentile of weekly earnings for full-time salaried workers, which projects out to 122,147. And then again, they plan to establish a mechanism for automatic annual update based on a fixed percentile or the consumer price index. So about the duties test, again, no changes were in the proposed rules despite a lot of anticipation that there would be major changes to the test. But what did happen is after issuing the proposed rules, the DOL issued a series of questions, and they're seeking comments to these specific questions. What, if any, changes should be made to the duties test is the first question. The next one has to do with modeling the duties test a little bit more like what California does, which is requiring a specific percentage of an exempt employee's time to be spent exclusively on the work that makes them exempt, basically that meets the required primary duty tests. So should the DOL go to that model? Is 50% the right amount? So those are the types of things that they're looking at with that question. Does a single standard test distinguish between exempt and non-exempt employees, or should the DOL reconsider its decision, which was made in 2004, to eliminate the long and short duties test structure? There used to be two tests, and if an employee didn't easily meet the short test, then you have to go to the long test, which was extremely complex. And then is the concurrent duties regulation for exempt employees working? So what that does is it allows somebody under the executive exemption to perform both exempt and non-exempt duties concurrently. So as long as they are performing some exempt duties, they can also perform non-exempt duties. So alternately, should there be a limitation on the amount of non-exempt work? And that kind of looks back up to that California model, which is, should they be able to do some non-exempt work? Should there be a percentage applied? So next slide, there's been a lot of a lot of articles and you know, I think at the most recent SHRM conference, there was a speaker that talked about what the experts are sort of fearing might happen in the final rules. So again, we've been talking about the fact that the proposed rules talk only about salary and not duties, but there is still a lot of speculation that the DOL may try to slide in some changes into the final rules that were not addressed in the proposed rules. So one former DOL administrator believes there's an argument that under the Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA, that the DOL cannot add changes to the duties test because it's not given the required public notice and opportunity to comment. But she also says there's a possibility that they may skirt those APA requirements, and their defense would probably be something like, well, they didn't say that there would be no changes, and in asking the questions that we just went over, they could say that that was the opportunity to comment. Now, that's not really the way that it works under the APA, but you know, there's a lot of speculation that they could try to get by with saying that that's how they met those requirements. And then the same person goes on to say that if they do change a duties test without notice and opportunity for comment on specific proposed changes, that there would be a lot of litigation to follow. So that'll be fun if that happens. Another former administrator of the Wage and Hour Division advises employers to steel themselves for the possibility of a double whammy. So he's saying basically the same thing as the other one, which is, you know, there could be final rules that address both salary and the duties test. And then an attorney in New York City says the DOL could simply insert its changes into the job duties test without further comment, and that many experts expect that that's the course they'll take, even though it would undercut the purpose and effectiveness of the notice and comment period. So moving on, there are others who believe that the DOL will not add changes to the duties test in the final rules, and their arguments, or their, I guess, basis for that thought is that the DOL is on record for saying that its objective is really to make changes to the salary test. It didn't say it is not going to make changes to the duties test, but again, it really refers to the salary test when it talks about these changes. The request for comments on changes to the duties test that we went over a couple slides back may indicate that a second round of proposed rules is coming, rather than that there's going to be changes in the upcoming final rules. And then also, I mentioned the APA requirements and the inevitable litigation that would happen if they do put that into the final rules. So what does that mean for us? Most experts believe that millions of exempt workers will no longer pass the test, and that is basically, there's a lot of industry specific concerns, like for example, you know, the restaurant industry, hospitality. A lot of managers in those types of establishments are not highly paid. So when you're talking about doubling the amount of pay to meet the minimum threshold, it's anticipated that, you know, those industries are going to be hit very, very hard. So next slide. How can you prepare for impact? Again, keep in mind that the DOL estimates nearly 5 million exempt workers will lose the exemption under the proposed rules. So if you were to wait for the new rules and then simply react in order to comply, it would probably look something like this, because these are kind of the obvious conclusions that I think most of us would take. You either increase salaries to the new threshold, or you reclassify and start paying overtime. I mean, those are kind of the simple answers. You know, another thing you could do is reclassify, but issue a mandate that limits, you know, anybody's hours to 40 a week. So basically tell your non-exempt workers that they are not allowed to work over 40 hours, and that way you avoid paying the overtime. But a better route would be to proactively take a more strategic look at the options, including, for example, offsetting the expense of overtime and salary increase with changes to bonus programs and other benefits. So, you know, there's nothing saying that you can't project the amount of overtime that you'll be paying if you reclassify people to non-exempt, and reduce other expenses accordingly. You could offer job shares if that works in your environment, so that you have two people sharing one job. They'll probably work combined over 40 hours a week, but because neither individual is working over 40 hours a week, there's no overtime. You could look at flex time strategies, maybe staggering workers under a four-day-a-week, 10-hour-a-day schedule, which would allow longer coverage throughout the day, but no overtime if they're just working 4/10s, and stagger the days so that you have all the days that you're open covered. And then something to keep in mind is employers can lower pay unless there's a collective bargaining agreement, of course, or some sort of a written contract or agreement. One strategy is to lower the salary, which is then going to become paid on an hourly basis, enough to offset the projected overtime. That's probably not going to be popular, but it is one way to do it. So next slide. Also, consider other potential impacts, as you prepare for the effective date. Unionized workers. So if you have unionized workers, could reclassification cause any employees to fall into a collective bargaining agreement? A lot of collective bargaining agreements apply only to non-management or non-exempt workers, but if you're reclassifying because your managers or exempt workers no longer meet the salary threshold, then they may be under the terms of the collective bargaining agreement, and you need to prepare for that. Will reclassified employees feel like they're being demoted? That's a real thing. I've had that experience personally. I mean, not to me personally, but I've, to people who have reported to me where their duties changed, to where I was no longer comfortable keeping them exempt, and so making them non-exempt. The dig there was really the fact that they felt like they were no longer as important or professional. So that's a real thing. Be prepared for people not to be happy with it. Some people will be. If they're motivated more by cash, they're going to be excited that they're eligible for overtime. But if they're more motivated by status, they're not going to want that change. Think about your communication strategy in advance. Aim to reduce the impact of the change on employees and the morale of your workforce. Be honest and open with why the changes have to be made and how you're going to make the decisions. Consider that, all the publicity surrounding this overtime expansion that's gone on for really years, that's going to cause exempt employees to question their classification. Anytime something like this is highlighted, people start thinking, I wonder if I really ever should have been classified as exempt, and maybe I'm owed a bunch of back overtime. So think about that. And if the answer to the above is yes, so if you do feel like people are going to start questioning their past exempt status, then prepare for any claims about that by reviewing your job descriptions. Make sure that the primary duties on paper demonstrate the exempt classification. So you want to make sure that the job description duties match up to the primary duties in the duties tests. And you also, maybe even more importantly, want to make sure that the employee is actually performing those primary duties. So finally, expect that the DOL will focus on enforcement once the new rules are in effect. So once they're finished with the work of writing and issuing the new rules, they're going to be looking for enforcement. I mean, they're going to audits are going to go up, claims will go up too. Again, because it's in the front of workers' minds now, so they're going to start questioning their new status, their former status. So that will generate complaints and claims. And the other thing is, this happens with any type of an audit or agency audit or investigation. They will always expand beyond the specific complaint. So make sure that you're prepared, if there is a claim, to address other things and not just overtime. Minimum wage, all the other areas that the Fair Labor Standards Act looks at. Those are going to be scrutinized with a claim, even if it's only about overtime. So another thing you want to do is refresh your knowledge about FLSA record keeping, because that, again, will be audited. And you want to make sure that you have systems in place to accurately track time worked. So if you are going to be reclassifying people from exempt to non-exempt, you need to make sure that you have something in place for them to start tracking their time differently than they used to. And you may even want to consider tracking time now, even on exempt employees, because if there are claims that go back, you want to have accurate information on their hours worked. So that is the presentation, and I think we have time for questions. Yep, 3 minutes.
All right, that's good. Thank you, Rhonda. Really appreciate it very much.